60 years of silence, broken in a single vote. In Ouagadougou, the gavel fell and an entire chapter of Burkina Faso's history was rewritten. What had once been tolerated in legal shadows was dragged into the harsh light of the law. For some, it was a return to order. For others, a step into controversy. But beneath the surface, something greater is unfolding. A continent wrestling not only with morality, but with sovereignty itself. Stay with us. This is not just a headline, it is a turning point in Africa's story. Subscribe and follow this journey until the end. Burkina Faso was once the exception, a land where colonial codes never outlawed same-sex relations, a silence that lasted more than 6 decades. That silence ended in September 2025, when the transitional parliament, under the watchful eye of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, voted unanimously to criminalize homosexuality. The law prescribes years in prison, heavy fines, and even deportation for foreigners. Yet, to read this as merely a legal amendment would be to miss the deeper truth. It is not only a law, it is a statement, a declaration that Africa is no longer content to whisper. It intends to speak in its own voice, even if the world refuses to listen. For more than 6 decades, Burkina Faso lived inside a paradox. The law did not punish same-sex relations, yet society rarely tolerated them. It was a silence, not of acceptance, not of celebration, but a silence born of history. When independence came in 1960, Burkina Faso did not inherit the restrictive penal codes imposed on so many other colonies. Unlike its neighbors bound by British laws that criminalize homosexuality, Ouagadougou's books remained free of those prohibitions. This absence was unusual. It placed the country in a small group of African nations where same-sex acts were neither endorsed nor condemned by law. For 60 years, that silence endured. It was like a seed buried deep in the soil, not visible on the surface, but shaping the roots of society. In homes and villages, in mosques and churches, homosexuality was whispered about with disapproval, treated as taboo. The law remained neutral, but neutrality did not mean freedom. It simply meant that the state did not enter the private space where culture and religion already held sway. That fragile balance lasted until the upheavals of the Sahel. In 2022, Captain Ibrahim Traoré rose to power through a coup, promising to restore dignity and sovereignty to a nation battered by insecurity and foreign interference. His government was transitional, but its ambitions were sweeping. One of its boldest moves arrived in 2024 with the announcement of a draft amendment to the Family Code. For the first time in the history of Burkina Faso, homosexuality was formally defined as a criminal offense in legal language. The seed of silence was being uprooted. The announcement did not emerge in isolation. Across Africa, a wave was building. In Uganda, one of the harshest anti-LGBT laws in the world had stunned observers by including the death penalty for so-called aggravated cases. In Ghana, Parliament debated fierce restrictions. Nigeria's prohibitions were long-standing. In neighboring Mali, a junta government had already imposed a ban. What had once been scattered became a rhythm, a continental drumbeat. Burkina Faso, once the exception, was now being pulled into the cadence. That rhythm reached its climax in September 2025. Inside the transitional parliament, lawmakers cast their votes. Not one dissenting voice was recorded. The decision was unanimous. Homosexuality would now be punishable by law. The penalties ranged from 2 to 5 years of imprisonment, fines that could cripple families, and deportation for foreigners. Overnight, a silence of 60 years was replaced by the certainty of criminalization. Justice Minister Edaso Rodriguez Baya stood before the nation to justify the change. He spoke of protecting society from bizarre behavior, words that echoed what many families already believed. In a country where over 90% of people identify with a religion, his statement did not sound radical. It sounded familiar. It sounded like home. Yet the symbolism went beyond the courtroom or the parliament floor. This was more than a statute. It was a declaration that Burkina Faso would not remain an outlier, a declaration that the law would now mirror the moral compass of its society rather than the frameworks of global liberal norms. For its supporters, this was the soil reclaiming its own roots. For its critics, it was a dangerous retreat from human rights. Either way, the silence was broken. A nation that had once been neutral now spoke with clarity. The gavel that fell in Ouagadougou reverberated far beyond its walls. It was heard in Bamako, in Abuja, in Kampala, and in Washington. It was not just a Burkina law, it was part of a wider African moment. But here lies the deeper question. Was this simply a legal housekeeping? Or was it the beginning of a continental shift, a movement that could redefine Africa's relationship with the world? The chamber was hushed when the final vote was cast. No hands raised in dissent. No murmurs of hesitation. One after another, members of Burkina Faso's transitional parliament declared their approval. In the end, unanimity, a word rarely spoken in politics, became reality. It was the climax of a journey that began in silence and ended in thunder. For the lawmakers, the decision was not merely procedural. It was a message to their people that the state was prepared to enshrine into law what many already believed in their hearts. Across towns and villages, the news spread quickly. In mosques after Friday prayers, in church gatherings on Sunday, in family courtyards shaded by mango trees, the response was largely supportive. For many, it was confirmation that their values had finally been recognized in the highest hall of power. Justice Minister Edaso Rodriguez Baya gave words to the sentiment. He spoke of protecting society from bizarre behavior, a phrase that may have sounded shocking to international ears but resonated deeply within the Burkina context. In a country where nearly every citizen belongs to a faith community, Islam, Christianity, or traditional belief, morality is not seen as a private affair. It is woven into the fabric of collective life. To legislate against homosexuality, therefore, was framed not as an intrusion, but as a safeguard of social harmony. The sense of triumph was palpable. Supporters described the unanimous vote as a victory for dignity, a shield for culture, a reaffirmation that Burkina Faso would no longer stand apart from its neighbors. The very unanimity of the vote became a symbol. No cracks, no fractures, only a chorus of agreement. It was presented as proof that the government and the people were in step, aligned in their understanding of what society demanded. Yet outside Burkina Faso, the reaction was starkly different. International human rights groups condemned the law as a regression. Western media framed it as part of a troubling wave of repression across Africa. Headlines in Washington, London, and Paris spoke of backsliding, of intolerance, of a dangerous precedent. For many observers abroad, the image of lawmakers applauding the passage of the bill was chilling, not triumphant. The contrast could not have been sharper. At the same moment that Burkina leaders celebrated alignment with their people, foreign commentators warned of diplomatic isolation and economic punishment. Two narratives ran in parallel, each claiming legitimacy, each seeing the same event through radically different lenses. And Burkina Faso was not alone. Across the continent, similar dramas were unfolding. In Uganda, one of the harshest anti-LGBT laws in the world had already provoked outrage, with provisions for the death penalty in aggravated cases. Ghana's parliament was engaged in heated debate over its own restrictions. Nigeria's government had long enforced its prohibitions. In neighboring Mali, also ruled by a junta, laws against homosexuality had already been passed. Burkina Faso's vote was thus both local and continental, a single step within a larger rhythm. That rhythm is what unsettled many international observers. One country might be dismissed as an outlier. Two might be coincidence. But when parliament after parliament takes similar measures, when the language of sovereignty and culture echoes across borders, it begins to feel like a coordinated wave. A wave that no external pressure can easily stop. Inside Burkina Faso, however, few saw it that way. For them, the vote was not about joining a continental trend, nor about defying international critics. It was about affirming identity. This is who we are, was the unspoken message carried from the parliament chamber into the streets. In a time of insecurity, poverty, and external interference, the new law gave the government an opportunity to demonstrate unity, to project strength, to show that leaders were listening to the heartbeat of their people. And yet, even amidst the applause, questions lingered. Was this truly about cultural preservation? Or was it also a political tool? In moments of crisis, leaders often turn to issues of morality to rally support, to shift focus away from economic hardship or security failures. By legislating against homosexuality, Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government reinforced its image as a defender of tradition, but also drew attention away from the mounting challenges of insurgency and underdevelopment. Still, the optics were undeniable. The unanimous vote created a spectacle that spoke louder than any speech. It was a declaration not only to citizens, but to the world. Burkina Faso had chosen its side. But what happens when that choice collides with the realities of international politics? What happens when sovereignty meets sanctions, when dignity encounters diplomacy, when applause at home turns into condemnation abroad? The law had passed, but its consequences had only begun to unfold. For ordinary citizens, the criminalization of homosexuality was not simply a matter of distant parliamentary debate. It touched lives, altered perceptions, and reshaped the relationship between individuals and the state. In the towns and villages of Burkina Faso, many families welcomed the decision as an affirmation of long-held values. Elders spoke of continuity, of preserving the moral order that had governed communities for generations. In markets and meeting places, the law was framed less as a restriction and more as protection of children, of families, of cultural integrity. It gave the impression of a government that finally mirrored the pulse of society rather than bending to outside expectations. For others, particularly younger citizens in urban areas, the reaction was more complex. Social media conversations revealed a quieter dissent, not necessarily in defense of homosexuality, but in unease over the state's growing reach into private life. Some wondered whether today's criminalization might become tomorrow's censorship in other areas. In this sense, the law sparked not only approval but also a subtle anxiety about the direction of political power. Politically, the unanimous vote strengthened Captain Ibrahim Traoré's standing. He had already presented himself as a leader unafraid to confront former colonial powers, a man who expelled foreign troops and sought to chart an independent course. Now, by aligning with the cultural instincts of his people, he appeared to embody sovereignty itself. His image as a protector of tradition, as a guardian of identity, was amplified. Yet politics is never one-dimensional. Some analysts argued that the law also served as a convenient distraction. Burkina Faso faces relentless insurgency in its northern regions, economic pressures from inflation and unemployment, and fragile infrastructure that hampers development. By focusing attention on morality, the government could consolidate support and rally unity at a time when divisions might otherwise emerge. In this reading, the law was as much a political shield as a cultural statement. Economically, the implications were uncertain. Burkina Faso has long relied on international aid and financial partnerships. Rights groups and foreign governments quickly raised the prospect of sanctions, aid cuts, or suspended loans. Such measures could bite deeply into a nation already struggling with poverty and insecurity. The paradox was stark. In affirming independence, Burkina Faso risked new forms of dependence if economic lifelines were severed. But within this paradox lies a broader continental movement, one that speaks to anti-colonial Africa. For many across the Sahel and beyond, the law was not merely about sexuality. It was about shaking off the remnants of colonial frameworks, rejecting the idea that morality must be measured by foreign standards. To criminalize homosexuality was, for supporters, to declare that Africa would decide its own codes of conduct, even if they contradicted global norms. In this sense, the law became both a cultural assertion and a political weapon against historical subjugation. The symbolism carried weight. In village assemblies, people spoke of dignity. In political rallies, leaders spoke of sovereignty. In sermons, religious figures spoke of fidelity to divine order. These multiple strands intertwined into a narrative of national self-assertion. The law became a mirror reflecting not only what society believed, but also how it wanted to be seen. Independent, unyielding, unafraid. Yet the challenges remained. Would foreign donors follow through with their warnings? Would the government be able to fill the gaps if aid was withdrawn? Could regional alliances with Mali, Niger, and others compensate for the potential loss of Western partnerships? The answers were not yet clear. What was clear, however, was that Burkina Faso had crossed a threshold. Silence was no longer possible. Neutrality had given way to clarity, and clarity always demands consequence. For the Burkina people, the debate was no longer only about law. It was about identity, about power, about survival in a world where global pressures and local traditions collide. Some saw hope in the possibility of forging a new path, one free from dependency on former colonial masters. Others feared isolation, economic decline, and further hardship. The road ahead is therefore uncertain, but what cannot be denied is that the decision has redefined Burkina Faso's political landscape. It has elevated Captain Ibrahim Traoré, reshaped public discourse, and positioned the nation at the heart of a continental struggle over values and sovereignty. The echoes of this law will linger, not only in courtrooms, but in the conversations of families, the policies of governments, and the strategies of international institutions. And so we are left with a question that cannot be easily answered. Will this bold assertion of cultural independence solidify Burkina Faso's identity, or will it isolate the nation in ways that weaken the very sovereignty it seeks to protect? The ripple of Burkina Faso's decision did not stop at its borders. Within days of the parliamentary vote, regional organizations and international institutions began to respond. The African Union expressed concern, while ECOWAS, already strained by disputes with Sahelian juntas, voiced unease but avoided outright condemnation. The European Union, by contrast, signaled that the law could affect development partnerships. At the United Nations, human rights officials warned of a dangerous precedent. From Washington, London, and Paris came sharper tones. Western leaders framed the law as a violation of international norms, threatening consequences for aid and financial cooperation. Statements from rights groups called on global institutions to take immediate action. The language was familiar: democracy, rights, inclusion. But in Ouagadougou, these words were heard less as universal principles and more as instruments of pressure. For the Burkinabe leadership, the message was clear. International censure was inevitable. The question was whether the country could withstand it. That is why alliances beyond the West have become central to its survival. In recent years, Burkina Faso has drawn closer to Mali and Niger, neighbors who share similar political trajectories. Together, the three countries have spoken of building a new Sahelian bloc, one rooted in mutual defense and shared cultural foundations. Beyond Africa, new partnerships have taken shape. Russia has offered military support, while China has deepened economic ties. These relationships are not without risks, but they provide alternatives. They create breathing space in which African governments can act without fear of immediate punishment from traditional powers. Seen in this light, the criminalization of homosexuality is more than a domestic matter. It is a test of how far African sovereignty can stretch when challenged by global norms. This balancing act is delicate. On one side stand the values and beliefs of Burkinabe society, affirmed in the unanimous vote. On the other side stand the realities of a globalized world, where trade, loans, and investment remain crucial. Can Burkina Faso afford to alienate the West? Can it depend solely on new partners to weather the storm? These are questions no single law can answer, yet they define the stakes of this moment. For now, Burkina Faso has chosen to walk the difficult road of defiance. It is a road lined with uncertainty, illuminated by the rhetoric of independence, but shadowed by the risk of isolation. The world is watching. Every reaction, every sanction, every alliance will test the strength of the nation's resolve. But can a country battling insurgency and poverty truly afford the price of confrontation? Or will the burden of global pressure bend even the strongest declaration of sovereignty? The law is written, but the story is not finished. What lies ahead for Burkina Faso is a path neither smooth nor certain. It is a road paved with both peril and possibility, stretching across the dusty Sahel and into an unknown horizon. One scenario is grim. Western partners, angered by what they call a violation of human rights, could impose sanctions or suspend aid. For a country already burdened by insecurity and economic fragility, such measures could deepen hardship. Food insecurity might rise. Infrastructure projects could stall. Foreign investment could shrink. In this scenario, the law meant to preserve dignity might inadvertently bring new suffering. Another scenario holds opportunity. By aligning more closely with Mali and Niger, Burkina Faso could strengthen a Sahelian coalition built on shared values and security cooperation. Partnerships with Russia and China could diversify economic lifelines, reducing reliance on Western donors. In this vision, the new law is not a chain but a shield, a way of carving out space for self-determination. With enough resilience, the country could build industries, foster trade, and stand taller in the global arena. Yet every step forward will test the government's resolve. Sovereignty is not achieved in speeches or statutes alone. It must be built in classrooms where children learn to shape their future, in factories where raw materials become products of value, and in fields where harvests feed not only families but nations. To sustain cultural independence, Burkina Faso must pair it with economic strength. Otherwise, the symbolism of the law will collapse under the weight of material reality. The choice then is not only between isolation and integration. It is about balance. How to affirm identity without closing doors. How to resist imposition without rejecting cooperation. How to walk a road that honors ancestors while building opportunities for the next generation. In villages, elders speak of fire, a fire that warms when tended, but consumes when left unchecked. Burkina Faso's law is such a fire. It can ignite pride, unity, and resilience. Or it can spark division, punishment, and decline. Which way the flames will spread depends on leadership, on alliances, and on the strength of the Burkina people themselves. What is certain is that the world will not look away. Each step Burkina Faso takes will be scrutinized, debated, and judged. Yet beyond the headlines, beyond the condemnations and endorsements, lies the deeper question: can a small, landlocked nation forge its own path in defiance of global winds? The answer will not come today. It will be written in the seasons ahead, in the resilience of a people determined to claim their future. But as the dust settles over Ouagadougou, one thought lingers like a whisper in the Sahel wind. Has the journey only just begun? Or has a dangerous line already been crossed? What began as a unanimous vote in a transitional parliament has become something far greater. It is no longer simply about the criminalization of homosexuality. It is about the soul of a nation and the voice of a continent. Burkina Faso has stepped out of the long silence and spoken with clarity, a clarity that reverberates far beyond its borders. For its leaders, this is not just policy. It is philosophy. It is the claim that Africa has the right to define its own moral compass, even when the world disagrees. For its people, it is an affirmation that their traditions and beliefs are not relics of the past, but living foundations worthy of protection. And for the continent, it is a sign of a deeper awakening, the stirring of anti-colonial Africa, where sovereignty is asserted not only in politics and economics, but in culture and law. The road ahead will not be simple. International institutions may punish, sanctions may bite, isolation may loom. Yet Burkina Faso's choice speaks to a larger principle. African sovereignty cannot be granted by outsiders. It must be claimed, defended, and lived by those to whom it belongs. That is the message carried in the gavel's echo, a message that may inspire others across the continent to walk the same path. The challenge is clear. To make sovereignty more than a slogan, Burkina Faso must translate symbolism into substance. Dignity must be matched by development. Independence must be sustained by industry. Pride must walk hand in hand with progress. Only then can anti-colonial Africa stand not as a dream, but as a reality capable of withstanding the pressures of a globalized world. And so the question remains: will this moment be remembered as the dawn of a new era of African independence, or as a gamble that cost more than it gained? If you believe this story matters, do not let it fade into silence. Share it, discuss it, and subscribe to walk with us as we follow Africa's unfolding journey.